after you make your comment.
Okay.
What is the whole debate about Star Wars? Other than a religious canon argument. We even still use the same wording.
Yeah.
When Disney took over, it was a change in what is and isn't considered canon. Welcome to the Belfast Podcast. I'm your host, Luke Byler, and we are finally here. The end of the canonization series of the Bible, where Daniel and I talk about canonization in general, how it happens in our culture, how it's happened in history, and how the canonization of the scriptures is no different. I've been circling around this idea for a few weeks now, so you finally get to see me flesh this out really in real time. These are things I've been thinking about in general, but I hadn't ever put it together in the way that I do in this conversation. So it was fun. It was very exploratory for me in that manner. Now, we have something very special after this. We've recorded a few episodes. I'm working on the editing, maybe working on some promotional material, but we are going through a series answering the question, what is the gospel? So if you've asked that question, if you get hesitant and you think, what do you mean when you say that? And you hear someone use that word, this series is just for you. So I hope that you stick around. I hope that you find the discussion we have this week interesting, enlightening, challenging. And if you enjoy it, subscribe, leave a like, give us a comment. If you've missed the first part of the series, I will link the playlist I'm going to make in the description here. And if you really enjoy what we do here, you want to get in touch with us, you can DM us on Instagram, follow us at the Belfast Podcast. You can email me at belfastpodcast@gmail.com. And as always, thank you guys very much for listening.
I want to say mid to late 100s, I think. Don't quote me on that. And I could just do a quick Google search, I guess, but he quotes like every work in the New Testament that I'm aware of, and some that are outside of. In fact, he actually on First Principles, and I think I mentioned this last episode too, he quotes some stuff that's considered non-canonical, like the Shepherd of Hermas. And he recognizes that some Christian communities don't consider it authoritative. He's like, and I understand you guys, you don't consider this to be authoritative, or maybe it was Clement, but he recognizes that some Christian communities don't consider it authoritative. And so he's like, he qualifies that with, hey, like, go with me on this, and we can have that discussion another time. Just like let's follow the point I'm trying to make right now. Which is super interesting, right? Because it shows that pretty early on, there's this differentiation unofficially, because there hasn't been a council made among early Christian communities of what is and what isn't a recognized text.
Go back real quick to that last quote by Mackey.
Okay.
Because I think with that Heiser illustration, it's that quote will hit a little bit different.
It's boring, but you'll learn a ton. And here's his summary. He says, the canon was never authorized or mandated by any general council of the ancient church. It rather rested on the early and largely informal consensus of the church. And we're talking about the centuries before, and there's any centralized power centers in Rome or Constantinople. It's just a broad international multi-ethnic movement where these writings have risen to the top. That's what he means by informal. In short, the church did not close the canon because it never started it to begin with. The canon was inherited from the apostles.
Pause.
To every single
canon was never authorized or mandated by general council. Well, if we take what Heiser just illuminated for us about the quotations of the canonical text within the letters and the writings of the early church fathers, and even your allusion to Origen or Hermas's reference to the shepherd, then that makes a lot of sense. Because then what is useful is not, well, it also goes back to Tim's other point about all these other Gnostic stories about Jesus that were never really considered, except in their own offshoot, to be authoritative. But as far as the Christian, Jewish, biblical canon, they were never even a part of it, because they weren't written until after it was organized and compiled. So it just, I think, again, and same thing with the Old Testament, just shows the organic nature of that which is authoritative, that which is valuable, that which is seen as useful and most helpful isn't the right word. Sacred, for lack of a better term, is what rises to the top and is what gets canonized and is what gets copied, is what gets spread around. It is what gets memorized. It is what gets used. So again, how would it function any other way?
Yeah.
It's a similar function to when things go, this is a horrible analogy, but when things go viral.
He uses the analogy.
Well, it gets, and then in some sense, at least for a period of time, things get canonized in culture, is maybe a helpful way to think about it. When you see these dogs in your front yard, just know upstairs I'm going hard, right? For a time, they're like, bing bong. That was a thing. That was a phrase. That whole thing, all those clips of a show that were made got passed around, and they get remixed in Instagram reels and in TikTok videos. The most recent one that was, and this will date this episode, but the recent one that's been really funny to me is that girl that hit her bedpost and made like the noise, and then
Oh,
that's
yeah.
been remixed. And so, yeah, it's just another example of the same thing. It's not that it's authoritative necessarily or has power over our lives, although it kind of does, you know. Yeah, it's
And
just
that,
an interesting parallel to make of, well, we have the same instances that happen in our culture, they're just different, right?
Yeah.
This happens with maybe a way better example of this is with film or movies, right? There's certain movies and that stand the test of time because of their power either to change the filmmaking landscape or to speak on things that are so relevant, not just for the time they're made, but for generations, right? Think of things like The Godfather, at least 1 and 2. Don't even bother watching 3. But even that's a funny case, right? Because, well, it's same people, same storyline necessarily, but many people, I think anyone you talk to who wants to talk about The Godfather is always going to tell you, yeah, 3 is not worth seeing at all. You can just skip it. But the first 2 might be some of the greatest American movies ever made. And they're movies about American immigrants and gangs and like all this stuff. But their themes about family and sacrifice and dedication are all things we can all relate to, regardless of our ethnicity or our heritage, right? You see, there's been film essays I've seen made about the movie Bonnie and Clyde, how it stole a lot from the French New Wave of filmmaking with montages and cuts in what's the word I'm looking for? Cuts in continuity, but you still got what's going on because of how things are cut. And there's a lot of like this is during the, I think it was during the, when was Bonnie and Clyde made? '67. So there's a lot of sexual stuff in the movie. There's a lot of innuendo in the movie. You don't see anything, but in the first scene, Bonnie is waking up and she's naked in her room. That's when she meets Clyde. But there's people that I've seen that I respect that talk a lot about how you could talk about film history in terms of movies made before Bonnie and Clyde and movies made after Bonnie and Clyde, because of how influential that movie was and changed the landscape of movie making for the next 50, 60, 70 years. We've seen a current transition in superhero movies, so much so that we now talk about superhero burnout because there's just so much of it. Now, there's an interesting question to ask about why our culture is so engrossed and obsessed with superheroes. I think that's worth thinking about. But obviously, ever since 2007, 2008, when Iron Man came out, it's changed the landscape, and we can argue about how that's affected certain companies. Even streaming and the closing of theaters, right, during COVID has made certain studios do, like HBO and Warner Brothers, do simultaneous releases on IMAX and on streaming. And then some films now are just purely for a certain streaming service, be it Amazon, be it Netflix. Why am I saying all this? Well, because there's a way in which our own culture and our own things that we think are sacred and do as religious ceremony, i.e., sitting in front of the TV, watching act, like who do we worship in our culture? Actors, actresses, directors, writers,
Athletes.
All of this is religious instinct, and we have our own canons. What else is the what is the like AFA, the American Film Association's top 100 movies, other than a canon?
Yeah.
And part of the point is, well, to understand how all these other films work and what they're doing, then you have to know these things. Same thing. Well, if you're going to understand what Jesus and all the allusions we made earlier, if you're going to understand Jesus and all the things he's doing and going into the wilderness and being led by the Spirit and going on the mountain and passing through the waters of baptism, you have to understand what goes on here. And so we just do the same thing in our culture with different things, but it hasn't changed at all.
Well, and the point that we've been making over the last 2, 3, 4 episodes is,
Oh, sorry, I
yeah,
have to make one more point, and I want you to riff on this after you make your comment.
okay.
What is the whole debate about Star Wars, other than a religious canon of argument? We even still use the same wording.
Yeah.
When Disney took over, it was a change in what is and isn't considered canon.
It made a lot of people upset, including me.
Yeah. So I won't riff on that, but go ahead. Make your other comment.
Well, we've been talking about this for the last few episodes, but why do we expect it to function any differently inherently? And I understand there's this miraculous divine hand at work, right? And so there is a difference a little bit, but I think the presence of Jesus as God incarnate shows us that God's primary mode of working is through us. And that's the whole paradigm set up in the Garden of Eden too. The kingdom comes, the gospel is brought through us. And we'll talk about gospel later, but I think that bears thinking about now is, why do we expect it to work any differently? We really shouldn't. So yeah, on the Star Wars thing, I was upset when the canon was changed, right? Because I grew up with a particular canon and I enjoyed that particular canon. And then they ruined it when they restricted the canon and then added on to that restricted canon in ways that I thought were inauthentic to the canon that was in existence before. Right. And to many people who care a lot more about Star Wars than I do, it was a more grievous offense than it was to me, because it held, in some sense, some religious significance for them. Right. And I mean, we still are. I mean, after Mandalorian season 2 in particular, they were like, oh, are they going to rewrite how this, are they like retroactively going to work in how all this stuff happened? That way we can do away with all of this sequel trilogy that no one liked, you know? It's,
Mandalorian is the Gnostic Gospels.
oh man, that's funny. But yeah, in a way, but I don't know. I think maybe the sequel trilogy is the Gnostic Gospels, right? And Mandalorian was people's hope at an attempt to bring us back to the original canon, right? And that's an interesting exercise, right? Is there was a canon shift, and no one that I'm aware of particularly likes that canon shift. And the hope is that we go back to the original.
To reference something I referenced a couple episodes ago, this is the same thing you're seeing with Lord of the Rings right now.
Yeah.
And I still hold to my original thesis. I think it's true that what Amazon wants is a past that, in our modern, to reflect the world we live in, interpretation of Lord of the Rings, when that was never really even the purpose of Lord of the Rings in the first place. So they want, and I think this type of way of talking about it is just the way that it should get talked about. It's not the fans of Star Wars or Lord of the Rings or the Ring, or those who don't want to see the Rings of Power, don't not like it because they're racist or they're misogynistic or any of the buzzword bad things that you can be in our society, or bad things you can be generally. But I'm just saying, in our society, those are the things that get people pegged down and then they're wholesale disregarded, which is the point of calling them that in this case.
They become heretics.
Exactly. But the best way to think about this is, the reason that Lord of the Rings fans are mad, at the same reason you were mad when Star Wars was changed, is because they're going beyond and dismantling the canon that has been established. And the canon, for lack of a better term, is the bounds in which you can play, at least in terms of the way we're talking about it currently. But even in Christianity and in Judaism, it's it's very much similar. And then we can talk differences between Protestant, like Catholic canon or Orthodox canon. But they play in one of my professors, and I like this analogy, compares it to, regular NFL football to arena football. Well, you have different boundary lines, so you're playing. It's not a different game, but in some sense it is a little different, because the rules and boundaries around the game itself are their own thing. So, yeah, I think this might be a helpful way to illustrate what we're talking about here, and to also illustrate the point. Yeah, and with the Bible, it doesn't really act that differently.
So I'll even say this, right? I think that there's some evidence that the gospel authors, in particular, at least most recently, I've been reading through the Richard Hayes chapter on Matthew. There's some evidence that Jesus is citing the Wisdom of Solomon or Ben Sirach, which are not canonical, right? They're technically extra canonical, even in the Jewish canon, but they're still held as like good texts in many communities. And so there seems to be evidence that there's this like extra canonical play happening too, but it isn't functioning necessarily. I mean, it's functioning in very similar ways, but it's not making them canon. There was no discussion about whether or not we should make the Wisdom of Solomon or Ben Sirach Old Testament canon, right? They wouldn't fit in with the New Testament, but there was no discussion about them being Old Testament canon, even among Jews. It was just, in fact, much of the work of those texts was in reference to the Tanakh itself and playing with and working with the principles established there. And so the boundaries of canon aren't necessarily rigid, but that is not to say that there isn't a, like, again, the canon rises out of the community, and the texts that rise the furthest above everything else, like as the tide washes away, those are the texts that are left.
And that was the point I was trying to make with our cultural analogy,
exactly,
with our cultural parallels,
Yeah.
is that the same occurrence happens. The movies and American history, we'll just stick with America at the moment because it's easier. The movies in American culture that have been the most influential rise to the top, and the American Film Association wants to say, here's the top 100 movies you need to watch if you're going to be familiar with how us as Americans make and talk about movies. If you're going to be a Star Wars fan, here's the things, here's the comic books, here's the novels, here's the movies that are considered, here's the shows that you need to watch and understand to be able to understand the world of Star Wars. If you're a Dune fan, there's debate about, is it just Frank Herbert's original 6, or because his son and another sci-fi author wrote 2 more books to wrap up the series, and they use notes from Frank Herbert, what and what isn't of their now like 12 books is canonical? Is it all canonical? Are some of them canonical? Which ones are and which ones aren't? In what ways do certain books contradict things that were originally set up in this series that are done differently by certain characters, or motivations that are retroactively transgressed? All of these conversations, it's the same thing. So, and yeah, with Star Wars, again, here's the things you need to read. With Batman, it's the same thing.
Yeah. I mean, I
And
could rattle
those
off.
those are a lot of my even major issues with the Batman, is I think it makes canonical errors with, in terms of my understanding of
Yeah.
canonical Batman. And there we go. How
Yeah.
much I'm ignorant of some of this stuff. But I think I won't even say canon. I think it makes fundamental character issues with Batman that it doesn't need to, that don't necessarily make him Batman anymore. But
Yeah, and I mean, using the Batman issue or the Batman topic, I could rattle off like several comic books that I think probably every major Batman fan should read, right? And some of them I haven't read.
Yeah.
So, I mean, how much am I in or out of that group? But I've got a friend who absolutely loves Batman, and I mean, I do too, but to a greater degree that he's read all of those, and has offered to let me borrow them. And every once in a while will call me up and be like, hey man, like this is a really cool one. You should think about reading it. And at this point, it's like, I'm in grad school. Like I don't have much capacity for anything else, but at some point I'd love to, right? In fact, I hope I do. But it's interesting because you can have a conversation. When I bought one of the Batman comic books that I own at the store, The guy that I bought it from, he was like, "Oh man, this is a classic. This is a great one." And he said he remembers when it first came out, and it's the one where Jason Todd dies,
Mm-hmm.
right? And so he remembers he voted in that whole, like, call in and let us know what you want to happen when Jason. He voted in it, which was kind of a really cool connection to like past, like really big moments in comic book history. Because I met someone who like could tell me a story about something that's very like a pivotal moment in Batman canon. And so like there are developments too. And yeah, I don't know, it's just interesting because you can reference within even certain like subsets of our culture different things that are and aren't canon. And that's one of those very pivotal texts that a lot of texts moving forward hinge on. Right. And so we have these things, like you're saying, we have these things in our culture today that function very similarly, right? And to use a Jordan Peterson way of describing it, a fundamental truth, or a religious text is a text or a truth that a lot of other texts or truths are dependent upon.
Mm-hmm. That's what makes something deep.
That's what makes something deep and profound and true and meaningful, right? And the Bible is that. And the canon that we have is that, for better or worse. And so that, I think, is what really drives a lot of what's going on with the canon, the formation of the canon, why it is the way it is. So, yeah. Do you have anything else to add?
Hang on.
Okay.
I just think making one more connection here, and then I'll be good to end it.
Yeah, okay.
I think because we've been swirling around this idea but haven't said it explicitly, and I think having him say it for us is going to be good.
Yeah.
I definitely spelled that wrong. There we go. Okay.
Did you send it to me?
I just emailed it to you.
Okay.
I should have. Yeah.
Okay, I just got it. Cool.
I think it's 4 minutes. You want to just do the whole thing? I was going to skip like 50 seconds, but.
Whoa. Yeah, sorry. It didn't play like I thought it was going to.
Why does it sound like Ben Shapiro?
Oh, could you hear that?
Yeah, he kind of sounds like Ben Shapiro from your microphone. Or from your computer. That sounds hilarious.
Ben Shapiro actually popped up as an ad. So it was a conversation, but it was the conversation between Ben and Jordan that popped up as an ad for a Jordan thing, I guess.
That's hilarious.
So let me. I've been getting ads. They've been okay. We ready?
Yeah.
What are the books that can be read to be transformative?
Sorry, pause for a second. We Sorry, I wasn't ready. I wanted to give a little bit of prelude about why we're pulling up this clip explicitly. Because as I said, Daniel and I, in talking about the biblical canon arising out of the collective culture, let's say, and not to say it's a bad thing, go back to our egregore episode. It could be things that rise out of cultures could be good or could be bad. And if we think that the Israelite culture is led by God and is the people of Yahweh, would we not believe that the books that rise out of that culture and are canonized are not books that are good for us, or
Yeah.
should be, or are going to be authoritative
Yeah.
because they arise from the people of God, the people of the book? Same thing in the Christian community. Okay, well, if we're led by the Spirit, and if we are now the temple, if we are the people of God, if we are those grafted in the tree, if we are in this thing like we think we are, would we not trust, as I said before, in interpreting, would we not trust that the Spirit's going to guide those in the community towards the things that they should be? And as a whole body that is checking itself, would not the ones that are the most important rise to the top? Would we not believe that that's part of God's plan?
Well, it seems like just as much a theological leap and theological conviction to I think you made this point in our last talk with the Old Testament, right? When it came to the writing being influenced and inspired in some sense, the editing, the consolidating and arranging being inspired, right? These things all happened in stages. And it seems more possible and more likely that the compilation and organization of a text is done with spiritual influence than the writing itself. That seems like an even riskier moment in time, right? And so is the Holy Spirit not with us at every step of the way that does exist in this process and that we can prove exists in this process?
Because I would claim there are other spirits working on other canons. So
Yeah, very much so. Very much so. And I think it's an unrealistic, or it doesn't take into consideration the whole.
Or maybe a better way to say that is what comes about as the canon illuminates what kind of spirit made it.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that it's just as much a
Think about
theological
Ryan
conviction.
Johnson's Star Wars movie. What is his movie but a postmodern deconstruction of Star Wars canon?
Yeah.
Yoda literally Luke literally burns the temple of the sacred Jedi books. Does it need to be any more explicit?
Yeah.
Ryan Johnson made one of my favorite movies of the next year, by the way, in Knives Out. So
yeah, that was a very good movie.
Yeah, but seriously, like if we're gonna recanonize Star Wars and then Ryan Johnson's gonna say, "Oh no, by the way, what does Kylo Ren say? Burn the past, or let it burn." What?
Yeah. Yeah. No, it's very, very correct. And I think it takes just as much trust that the canonization, the compilation, the organization of the books, and then the whole canon itself was led by the Holy Spirit as it does that the writing itself was. And you're either going to accept that or you're not, and that's fine. And we can make arguments for why something was or wasn't included, why something was good to include or not good to include intellectually, but from a faith standpoint, it's the same qualification. And I don't understand why the question makes certain Christians uncomfortable.
Yeah.
Because it doesn't need to.
And on the other side, if someone's going to say, well, that's just superstitious nonsense that you'd say that these books just kind of arose out of this thing and that's what we should accept as truth. And I'd point to all the things. That's why I'm fine talking about this for 20 minutes. I'd point to all the things we've just talked about. Okay, well, what about what's canon in Star Wars? What's canon in Batman? Why is it canon? Why do we get mad when the canon shifts? What's canon in American movies? What's canon in American literature? Who are the greatest? Who should I be reading? Well, it's the same function. So you're just as superstitious about Star Wars and Batman and like at least the rising of what is considered authoritative in those senses as like I am about the Bible. And you could say, well, it's just some fictional world. And I'd be like, sure, but you have a lot of religious fervor for this thing too. So
Yeah. Well, I mean, I'm fully convinced that both politics and sports at a minimum function in religious ways, like to a high degree.
Oh yeah, and we haven't even brought up how politics functions in the same kind of canonical way too.
Yeah.
Right? You have certain mythologies around each, at this point, each political party, right?
Yeah.
The leaders, the themes, the stuff that was fought for, how things have progressed, right? In different ways, how things have shifted. Yeah, you have the religious fervent conservatives, you have the religiously fervent Democrats, right? And that, the things that happen at the polls is, I think, to many people, not any different than worship on a Sunday morning to other people.
And sometimes those two become
One.
married to
dangerous.
wishes. Yeah. So anyway, ready?
Yeah. I made my point.
What are
Go ahead.
the books that can be read to be transformative? I mean, the otherness that realizes and that awakens and opens up the self, that turns those lights on, is not just a random otherness. I mean, you can look at a brick wall all day and never get anything like what we get by looking at the King's Chapel that we just.
Otherness. And you mean spirit? Is it a spiritual thing that's happening? Anyway.
Came from a few minutes ago, that the levels of pattern and depth and beauty that are present in that building, that's a kind of metaphor for what the most wonderful, most fecund texts of our own past offer to us. There they are lying on the shelf, but when opened up and explored fully, they open up in us. Yeah, they're portals. So I suppose
a book isn't a book. A book isn't paper.
Yes.
That's your memory. That's your perception of the book. It's a portal.
Yes.
And one of the ideas, the postmodern idea, is that, well, there's no canon. And if there is a canon, it's only there to support the tyrannical patriarchy, because of course the tyrannical patriarchy is the explanation for everything. But I've been trying to solve that problem technically I have a small staff that's trying to produce an educational system online. And we've been trying to understand, well, what is it that makes a book canonical? There's actually a technical answer to that. So you imagine that books exist in relationship to one another. That's a perfectly reasonable postmodernist claim, by the way. Books exist in relationship to one another. Okay, well, some books have hardly any relationship to other books. Those are trivial books. Now, they might be undiscovered works of genius. That's another possibility if they're recently written. But it doesn't matter, because you can't separate the wheat from the chaff. At present, it's too difficult. There's too much chaff. But if you go back into the past, you can rank order books by the degree to which they've influenced other books. So it's like citations in some sense. And the books that have influenced the largest number of other books are the canonical books. And the ultimate canonical book in the West is clearly the biblical corpus, because it's influenced virtually everything. And so you have to know it, because it's implicit in everything else. And so you start there, and so you have that. You have that knowledge, at least to some degree. And it gives you the foundation, the metaphorical foundation, the conceptual foundation, the mythical foundation that you can use to then, well, then maybe you can now Shakespeare opens up to some degree, and now Milton opens up to some degree, and Dante opens up to some degree. And you think, well, why should those open up? And the answer is, well, as the social constructionists claim, you're at least in part a historical creature. Well, then those books are about you. They're the the patterns in those books are the patterns of your perceptions and your actions. And without understanding them, then you don't know who you are, and you can't guide yourself properly through life. And so you come into university and you encounter experts, and they say, look, this is canonical. Why? Because it's had a disproportionate influence on everything else. So there's something here that you need to know about, because it's about you. And it isn't about the you that's here now in some sense. It's about the you that can unfold across time in the best possible way. So each of those works is a call to adventure. Every painting that's a great painting, or a building like the King's Chapel, if that's not a call to adventure, I mean, what else could it be? We were talking about that. So these ancient buildings, these great ancient buildings that Europe is littered with, people were aiming at something beyond themselves, beyond the span of their lifetime. They engaged in the collective manifestation of these great works to aim, to participate in aiming at something that was beyond them. It was a divine aim. They had the will to produce this beauty that transcended centuries. And maybe the will that produces beauty is always aligned with that which transcends centuries. Maybe those are the same things. I mean, even paintings, oil paintings, they take a moment in time and they cast it into a permanent form that can be preserved across centuries. And so there's something about the establishing a relationship with eternity that's key to the construction of something that's beautiful, and then that in itself becomes a call to a relationship with eternity. So, and you need that. People hunger for.
He's the highest paid employee in our federal government, and beginning in the
Was that it?
Yeah. I mainly wanted it for his technical definition of canon,
Yeah.
the text that disproportionately affect all the other texts.
Yeah.
Which is why we get mad, say, when the canon changes, because you're saying, oh, well, all this things affecting other things actually doesn't matter. Well, I think it does.
Yeah. No, I agree. It's just super practical, right? I mean, that's a good way of constructing what is and isn't important. And I'm even thinking about in some critiques that I got on a recent paper, one professor told me, like, hey, if you're going to talk about this, you need to read this article and this article and this paper. And he gave me a canon of things to look at.
Mm-hmm.
That way I could refine my views. And
he gave you a canon to a viewpoint that has no canon, or wants no canon.
He did.
Which is funny.
He did. Because he gave me a very postmodern deconstructionist canon, but it's a canon, right? And he even referenced it. He didn't use the word canon, but he referenced it as like functioning as a canon, right? He was like, if you're going to talk about this, you either have to engage this.
Yep.
You don't have to agree with them, but you have to engage this, and you need to use similar language than they do, because I was using very different language.
Yeah.
And he was like, if you're going to argue about this, you need to demonstrate that you know that you're in the guild, right? You need to demonstrate that you know what they're talking about by using similar language, by addressing their points in either agreement or disagreement, and taking care of the process that way. And so it demonstrates that there is a canon, there is a waterfall, right? What about the waterfall? You just gave me a waterfall, right? And like, I don't know what else to say.
Yeah.
We can't have a conversation if there's not a waterfall or a hill for me to climb up and you to climb down. Right? I think that's another good Lewis analogy that I don't know if we've actually talked about.
We might have to, in the later days when we get there finally, we might have to make a Lewis canon.
Maybe.
Or at least a place to start. Maybe not a canon per se, but I mean, all of what we've just talked about, how it all seems to circle back. to how literature functions, how communication functions. There's a great video that might be worth its treatment, maybe on my own, from a channel that does a lot of writing and script and story stuff. And he talked about magic and why it's such a good tool for storytellers. And his basic point was magic is a good tool for storytellers because it's a good way to defamiliarize ourselves with our own world, but then also it can help us look at certain things that are in our own world, but if talked about in a concrete reality way would be either cheesy or stupid. And
Yeah.
who was it? Was it the Greek myth about the guy that Midas? He talks about Midas,
Mm.
right?
Yeah.
Midas touch. What does that mean? Well, everything he touches turns to gold. That's his wish. But then what's the point? Part of the point of the story is maybe you should be careful what you wish for. Or maybe everything, the pursuit of wealth and power or accruement of resources is not the highest order you should pursue.
Or
Because what happens to Midas? He touches his children and they turn to bricks.
Yeah.
He touches food and he can't eat, so he dies of starvation. It's magical in the sense that could actually really never happen.
Yeah.
But it's there to prove a deeper, let's say, a foundational point about value, about desire, and all of these things. And so the point in the story is, or in the video that I watched about it, is this is why the tool of magic and magic systems and spells and things of that nature are good, because it defamiliarizes us with our own world. Oh yeah, this in this kind of world, these things can happen, but then it tells us something about our own world. So
Oh,
Yeah.
like to the Midas touch example, it also proves the point of if everything's super, nothing is, right? If everything's gold,
Yeah.
nothing's gold. Like
Yeah.
part of this will show my hand at a little bit of economics, but part of the reason things have value is based on scarcity
Mhm.
for starters, but also their utility and
Mhm.
their ability to help us control the opportunity cost that we navigate throughout the world. And so if everything you do is just successful, I mean, this is one of the reasons why I actually think death is what gives life its meaning. It's because if you just lived forever, you'd be Wolverine from Logan.
Yeah. Why would you
Right.
make any decisions that are risky?
And why would you not make any decisions that are risky, right?
Why would you sacrifice anything if you are going to live so long that you would never have to? Why aren't you completely a hedonist?
Yeah, I mean, and that's what ultimately would happen, right? And so, I mean, this is kind of breaking away from the whole canon idea and the Bible and everything, but I think it's worth thinking about, and I think it's very profound. So
Yeah. My point in bringing up the magic and the stories and stuff is because, well, this is, part of back to the point about Canon, Midas touch. All I have to do is say that, or everything you touch turns to gold. You understand the reference. You might not even know the whole story. I doubt you do.
Yeah.
I didn't until he explained it in the video, but I was like, oh no, I know what that is because it's referenced. Again, well, it's canonical.
Yeah.
It is so powerful that it has affected rap lyrics. I know Kendrick has talked about having the Midas touch, you know, like,
Speaking
and
of,
that's in the own. Oh, I haven't listened to his new album, by the way. I've got like halfway
Kendrick
through.
is king. Kendrick is king.
Yeah.
Okay.
Anyway, yeah, let me listen to the whole thing a few times at least. And
Yeah.
we can talk about it.
I'll have to re-listen to it too. I've only listened to it 5 times. So.
But anyway, like these and Geppetto, right? J. Cole has a lot of Geppetto lines. So does like all these stories, they're canon.
Yeah.
Why? Because they speak to something deep, and they affect forms of storytelling that are way outside of literature or movies, or that's when you really know that has that power.
Mhm.
But this is the way it functions and the way we interact and we communicate. That's the way it is in literature in its own form, and then how it can cross over to other forms. That's the way the Bible seems to be working in its oral and written traditions, and even the traditions of Midrash and all the explanations of the rabbis, right? They're all trying to tell stories and understand what this means. And then with the formation of the Jewish and the Christian canon, it's the same thing. Whatever arises seems to have arisen as authoritative and useful and productive and challenging to, because that's the other thing about all these stories that we haven't even mentioned, is at some level they push against our natural instincts, right? They challenge us. That's why they're memorable.
Mhm.
So if you have stories or a canon that doesn't do any of that, it's not really a canon, or it's not a story worth telling. It's a story like the Gnostic Gospels, ones that we're probably just going to forget. So to say what we've been saying all episode, why would we expect it to occur any other way? Because it just seems to be, to use a Lewis-like phrase, the nature of things. In the fixed world that God has created, in the way that we communicate and interact, it just seems to be how it is. And I don't know if I have any better explanation. Obviously, the Spirit's going to lead, as I said, the Spirit's going to lead any kind of canonization of anything, or a spirit. We just attribute it to Jesus and God and the Holy Spirit as those who are leading us, as we should. And I believe they do. So shouldn't that, at least in a large way, give us comfort about the canon that we have? And to quote N.T. Wright again, I think we have the Bible that God intended us to have. And apparently Jesus thinks so too. I don't have anything else to say.
No, I think that's a good place to call it.
All right.